Hello everyone, this is StrawberryShorty, and as promised in my channel update video, I am planning to try and do reviews for certain kinds of games each month. Since October is Halloween and the newest Dark Pictures game is coming out in a few weeks, I figured it was the perfect time to do the first two titles in the series, as well as Until Dawn, which is kind of like its predecessor. When I first heard of Until Dawn, I was dying to play it. I'm not as into slasher flicks as my sister is, but I do love horror games. I also love games where your choices matter, but often find that they disappoint me in terms of the story actually changing. Regardless, the idea of a horror game where your choices affect the characters and story really intrigued me, but I didn't have a PS4 and wouldn't get one for a really long time. By the time I finally got around to playing this game, I knew pretty much the whole story. So the game revolves around a ski lodge in the mountains, where a group of high school students are reuniting after a tragedy that happened there the previous year. There's Sam, the nice girl, Josh, whose family owns the lodge, his best friend Chris, Ashley, the girl that Chris likes, Caddy Emily, Emily's boyfriend Matt, her ex Mike, and Mike's current girlfriend Jessica. I don't want to give away too much of the plot here, but shortly after reaching their destination, the group comes to realize that they might not be alone. Someone is out to get them, and they might just play a part in what happened a year ago. Trapped up in the mountains with no way to get help, the group has no choice but to try and survive. Until dawn. You control each of the characters at least once, exploring, doing quick-time events, and making decisions that could lead to their untimely deaths, or the deaths of those around them. These choices can also affect their relationships with the other characters, as well as a series of personality traits they have. The relationship mechanic was somewhat interesting, as turning a character against you can result in unforeseen consequences. On the other hand, I don't feel like it had as much of an impact as I'd have liked, especially in terms of the overall story. It seems like this applies even more to the traits thing, which not only appears to be completely irrelevant, but also kind of interferes with the choice-making, sort of. For example, there's a scene where a character can express sympathy or brush off something that happened that they were involved in. If you choose to show remorse, your dishonesty goes up, as apparently that character isn't really sorry about what happened. I know these characters have their own personalities, but it feels kind of weird to be given a choice like that and then have the game contradict what we say. The QTEs in this game are pretty generous compared to a lot of other games. If you fail most of them, you'll usually be given another chance. There's a scene where a character is running away from something and has to jump over a pit. If you fail, they'll end up hanging on for dear life, and you'll have to pass another QuickTime event to save them. There are also some occasions, however, where one missed or late button press can result in immediate death, or when doing less than perfect in a QTE sequence can cause something bad to happen. Overall, though, I do feel the game is pretty generous in this regard, with only a few exceptions. There's also a premonition mechanic. You can find various totems scattered around which give you a glimpse of something that can happen in the future. These totems are themed around things like death and fortune, and are supposed to serve as hints for the player. I honestly didn't like this mechanic because it felt kinda useless. The glimpses of the future you can get are far too brief, and often feel more like teasers than anything actually helpful. It also kind of seems like this game might have originally been intended to be released in an episodic format. Before starting each new chapter, you get a reminder of what happened during the last one, even though you probably just played it. It's not the worst feature, as some people might take a break between chapters, but they could have made it, an optional feature, so that you could turn it off in the settings or something. So, now that we've talked about how the game works, is it actually good? It looks great, I think the actors are all great, and the premise is interesting. I definitely would say it's worth playing, but there are some issues. Like many of these games where your choices matter, in the grand scheme of things, they don't. The overall story is fairly linear, and some characters even have plot armor until very late in the game. It always more or less ends the same way, with the only real differences being who is alive and what they have to say about their experience. There's also an M. Night Shyamalan level twist, which I knew going into the game and didn't like. This is just my opinion, of course, and I know plenty of people that actually enjoy the twist. I've also heard complaints about the movement speed, as outside of QTEs you're going to be doing a lot of walking. And I mean walking. There is no running outside of cutscenes. There's a button you can press to walk faster, but that's it. There's also an insanely frustrating motion control thing. You can choose to pick between choices by tilting the controller, but that's not what I'm referring to. There's a mechanic where you have to hold the controller perfectly still, with the consequence of failure often being immediate death. Unfortunately, this works extremely poorly, and I'd often just put the controller down completely and hope for the best. There was one other control issue I had, but I could never quite tell if it was my controller or the game. When you need to turn pages, you do this by swapping the touchpad. This would never work right for me, and it took a ridiculous amount of effort just to get through some documents. All that being said, Until Dawn is definitely not a bad game. Most of the characters are pretty enjoyable, except one, and if you've played it already, you probably know who I mean. I'm sure some people like them, but I definitely don't. On the other hand, I did end up really liking another character I never would have expected to. Most of the characters feel like they're designed to be largely unlikable, which is probably a nod to horror flicks where you're usually watching a bunch of annoying teens get butchered. Anyway, I feel like I've said all I can about the game without touching upon spoilers, so if you still haven't played the game, you may want to leave and come back when you have. The game starts with a prologue that has a foregone conclusion, something I loathe about these kinds of games. I know that the twins disappearing is extremely important to the story, but it's certainly done better than similar plot points in, say, Heavy Rain, but it still kind of gets on my nerves. Also, it wasn't just a prank. Never do that kind of thing to someone, no matter how much you hate them or feel they deserve it. The psychiatrist was a psychiatrist. I cannot speak today. The psychiatrist was a well-done character, and the uncanny valley look of him actually helped to make the character creepier. Your sessions with him are interesting, but feel a little pointless. They don't affect the actual story at all, and only a few of them result in small cosmetic changes during the scenes later in the game. I guess the scenes are meant to give us more insight into Josh, but we're choosing his answers, so again, only a few of these sessions actually feel relevant. Speaking of Josh, he could have been handled so much better. Anyone going into this would immediately suspect him of being the killer, as he had an obvious motive, acts strange from the start, and his family owns the lodge, giving him ample time to set everything up. His goal is revenge for his sisters, which is actually pretty understandable, but he targets people that had no part in the so-called prank, like Sam and Chris. I think with Chris he's trying to push him together with Ashley, but then what about Sam? And why does he not really target Emily, Matt, Jessica, and Mike, who were actively part of the prank? There are some hints that Josh might be mentally ill and was not properly diagnosed, but it's not really focused on. He's also ultimately the most cheated character, guaranteed to either die or become a Wendigo. Again, I really don't like these kinds of foregone conclusions in choice-based games, and the same thing applies to the stranger, who also dies no matter what. As for the other characters, I hated Emily the most. I'm sure no one is surprised. She's intelligent and resourceful, but her attitude is the literal worst. She picks fights, she's rude, and after Matt died saving her sorry butt in my playthrough, she lied to the police and told them he didn't even try to save her. Like, that's just horrible. Like, you're gonna let people remember him like that when he essentially died a hero? And, like, Matt wouldn't have died if I'd played truer to myself, because no way would I have stayed on that shaky fallen tower. I'd have jumped to safety and continued trying to help Emily. But in my experience, games like these tend to not take into consideration our intentions. If I jumped, they'd probably have treated it as me abandoning her. Matt also didn't have the flare gun because, okay, that fool had an axe. That's my weapon of choice for if I ever get stuck in a zombie apocalypse, and he just leaves it behind when we climb the tower. Like, I'm not giving him the flare gun. That's my weapon. You had yours. I also found myself kind of hating Ashley, mostly because I know that she will essentially murder Chris if he tries to shoot her during the killer's second test, despite the fact that she literally tells him to let her die to save him. Even if she hadn't, it's not like he just tried to kill her for no reason. He was in a terrifying situation and, you know, at the mercy of a killer. To my surprise, I ended up really liking Mike. He became increasingly more badass as the game went on, despite having initially come off as just your stereotypical jerky jock. The only problem I have with him is his insistence that they try to get off the mountain, putting themselves in even more danger rather than just wait in the safe place for morning, when the Wendigos will be gone and help will arrive. Speaking of the Wendigos, as I mentioned earlier, I did not really like this twist. The idea of a teen horror movie where you're dealing with a killer sounded way more interesting than something supernatural. I can see why some people like it, though, and it might even make Josh being the obvious killer intentional, because you think you have it all figured out, and then suddenly, Wendigos. It was interesting, if not a twist I personally cared for. I kind of hope the devs eventually make a game that sticks to the initial premise with no supernatural stuff at all. I kinda doubt that's gonna happen, though, given the way the Dark Pictures stuff is going. And for those of you who are wondering, Matt was my only casualty. Well, technically. I might have reloaded a few times. Anyway, that's about all I have to say. After my Evil Within reviews, this probably comes across as way shorter. It might just be because I first beat Until Dawn a while ago, but I don't have a lot of strong opinions about it past what I've already said. The same kind of applies to Man of Medan, which I plan on reviewing next. I've got way more to say about the game after that, though, and might even end up doing a follow-up video about my theory regarding what happens during it. For now, however, thanks for watching, and please share your thoughts in the comments. Bye!